Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by Jose Nino. He is a new voice in political commentary, although he's been quite prolific. He operates a Substack called Jose Nino Unfiltered, and he writes about neoconservatism, modern politics, all the stuff that we love to talk about around here, especially on the news hour, all this type of thing. And we're going to find out more about him, his background, why he started his Substack, and what he's up to. So, welcome, Jose, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. Why don't we start from the beginning? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into writing on Substack.
Well, I have been involved in politics in some shape or form through work or commentary for now, I'd like to say nearly 2 decades. And I'm now more of a writer, though. I've been doing freelance writing for the most part since 2018. And I tend to focus more on topics concerning international relations, corporate power, elite power politics, and even more like deeper politics that kind of goes beyond what you see on TV and the ballot booth, like elections. I like to look at those type of dynamics and study them. And what prompted me to go on Substack was really just seeing how there's like a new medium for independent journalists to actually make a living and publish content without having to deal with strict editorial lines that are often very political in nature and don't let writers fully express themselves.
Perfect, perfect. I mean, there's a lot going on right now. We're recording on the 11th of June. There's a lot happening right now. So why don't you start us off with some of the stories and things that you're following?
Well, I study a lot of issues with regards to foreign policy now, respect to the Trump administration, which claims to be America first and against so-called endless wars. But my research has actually shown that there are elements within the Republican Party and broader conservative think tank space that want to co-opt this movement that ostensibly claims to be against perpetual wars abroad and all this, and just gear it back in a more pro-Zionist type of direction that is still very much obsessed with maintaining American hegemony abroad. That's one of my key focuses with regards to my work in recent months. And I've had in one of my recent Substack interviews, because I have a podcast there as well, I
Yeah, I saw
brought
that.
on
Yes,
a
I was going to ask
anarchist
you about
political
that.
commentator.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had Keith Preston on to talk about that, and he's generally on the same wavelength as I am with respect to how there is a concerted effort now in the so-called Trump era where most politicians from Trump to even standard Republicans will talk about having a more reasonable foreign policy that's not as obsessed with getting involved in conflicts abroad. But when you peel back the onion and look at the donors and some of the people they're surrounding themselves by, they tend to be the neoconservatives and Zionists and Israel firsters of yesteryear. They're just using different cosmetics to advance an imperial agenda, effectively.
I want to dig into that a little bit because the Israel situation is a little bit of a kind of an odd, unique thing in American foreign policy. And I have long said our support for Israel has made a shipwreck of our foreign policy in the Middle East. And to the Trump administration's credit, they're the first ones who've really, I think, done a better job of trying to unwind that and improve relations with neighboring countries in spite of, you know, of maintaining a pro-Israel stance, a lot of which has to do with the evangelical movement, Christian nationalist movement, all this sort of thing. That's a whole other conversation. Um, But there is, and it has been especially obvious in the last couple of years that Israel has a very, very kind of broad levity to do what they want without the United States saying a whole lot or complaining about it very loudly. And none of our other allies enjoy that space. I think a lot of other countries sort of wish they had that much kind of undying, unending support. And I want to get your thoughts on this. Do you feel like we are finally ready to have a more honest conversation about America's policy about Israel? Because they've had such a wide mandate for so long, and a lot of that comes from Christian nationalists um, and from the evangelical movement. And now I feel like there's sort of two parallel conversations: an older generation that wants to kind of double down on the same policy, and a younger generation that's very much into different ideas. The left kind of not wanting to sponsor Israel for genocide reasons, the right for financial and other reasons. What do you feel the dynamics are at play about that? Because we're having a lot of interesting conversations around that right now.
Yes, you mentioned generational divides, and I think that's what's key because even one shocking poll I saw as well is that younger white evangelicals are also turning against Israel. And it seems to me that this is becoming transpartisan and even transracial as well when it comes to people becoming more skeptical of Israel. And there's several factors, in my opinion.
Mhm.
You have now, with alternative media, much more outlets that cover what's going on in Israel, Gaza, and all of that stuff in a more in-depth manner than in previous decades where you had only like legacy media.
Right.
And that gave you a very skewed and limited perspective on the issue. Now you have a lot of creators, not just abroad, but also even in Gaza itself, that are basically live streaming a genocide, if you will, at an industrial scale. And the information is is disseminating everywhere to the point where you have like a global consensus now that this is, with the exception of a few countries. Now, this is interesting too because I have done some research that you mentioned the Christian nationalism. Some of the few countries where Israel does have like a positive image tend to be where there is a large evangelical base, and you'll be surprised that there's countries like Nigeria and Kenya where Israel still enjoys an abnormal level of support, and a lot of this is due to an evangelical presence where Israeli interests have seen this, especially in the United States, which is most famous for it, as a base to tap into. And countries like Guatemala, Kenya, Nigeria have this feature, and even countries like India, they that have a Islamic militancy issue. That's a contradiction that the Israelis are able to exploit abroad to build support, but this is more the exception than the rule because most of the globe, because of alternative media and younger generations of people consuming content in different media outlets, it's thoroughly undermined Israel's vice grip over like the discourse, and also has not just opened up questions about the US's relationship with Israel, but also it's opened up questions about like the nature of US foreign policy and how it just serves oligarchical interests and not the national interest.
Well, no, I mean, I think that is an interesting one of the things that I think is common in both some of the progressive stuff that I hear and some of the MAGA stuff that I hear is that on different issues, everyone's kind of, I think, exhausted at the global international leadership project that America has pursued in
Yes.
one form or another since 1919. a hundred years
100%.
later, especially post World War II, people are tired, they're exhausted, it's expensive, and I think people are, and I was having a conversation last night with someone. I said, we're, doing all of this stuff around the world, but look outside, roads not good, bridges not good, all these things in our own country are falling apart. And I think people are kind of like, well, maybe it's time to redirect some resources back to ourselves.
Yes, actually, I've interact with people all across the spectrum from the hard left to even the hard right. And one thing I've noticed over the years of working in the political process and also writing about it is that the respective bases of both like the Republican and like Democratic parties, they are far more non-interventionist and less likely to support wars abroad than the party leadership itself. There's a big disconnect, and that's where you start to see how the US is like democratic, so-called democratic project is starting to be questioned by people because it's becoming very unresponsive to their demands, and it's becoming incredibly oligarchical as you're seeing all this talk about, for example, in the Trump administration, the establishment of Palantir, that really shady cybersecurity organization that's gained influence. And what I've argued we're seeing in the US now is a descent into kind of like naked oligarchy where there's going to be no pretense of democracy and that politicians appeal to. They're just going to be engaging in a very oligarchical and like tyrannical manner that serves corporate interests and certain pressure groups at the expense of the everyday Americans. And the good news is, though, I've seen more and more people now starting to question like the very merits of the system. They're not talking about it in like marginal terms or engaging in the typical two-party dialectic. They're starting to look at it more from like a systemic, like it's like a systemic failure, and that we have to start rethinking several assumptions that we've held for decades about the US system.
Yeah, mm, I think that's for those of us of a liberal persuasion who really believed in that, thought it was a net good for the world and a net good for us, because we've done very well as a country since 1945. Um, all this sort of thing. I think that is a bit of a disturbing conversation to have, because for the longest time it was sort of the subject one should never talk about sort of thing. And now we're having this very open and active conversation about it. And I think a lot of people, especially younger people, are just absolutely they're done. They're tired of it. They're ready to move on to something else. And I think the oligarchical aspect is very interesting, because the Palantir thing is so worrying. Anytime the government starts making lists of people, that never ends well. And some of us
Yes.
are old enough to remember the Bush years and the Patriot Act when they were doing that initially. And people said
Yes.
back
Yes.
then this isn't going to end well, and lo and behold, here we are. And so I think there's I, I find it as someone who's spent a lot of time criticizing the system, I find it at one time really good, but I also find it frustrating because it seems to be going in all the worst ways. Like, it's like, okay, I love your energy, but can we direct that towards talking about our economic system, talking about capitalism, our lack of social supports, our maybe need for some democratic socialism? And instead, it seems to be people are just ready to burn it all down. And that is for me at a personal level, but also just kind of looking at society. I think that burn it all down attitude is very difficult, and you're starting to get it from both ends of the political spectrum. And I think people don't know what they're really asking for.
Yeah, there's I sometimes kind of dabble in that as well, but I think there are ways to tweak things and move it in a more constructive direction, because when you do the burn it down model, it actually does because nature abhors a vacuum. It
It
actually
does.
does serve elite interests. Um because at least when you have like a state One of my things is because I no longer really identify as part of the right that much, is that with a state, you can at least check private capital interests that I think are just as much of a threat as a unaccountable like federal agency or government bureaucracy. I think that private interests and corporate interests um, are as much of a threat and should be treated as such um, in juxtaposition to say like the state, because that's one flaw I think that you see with conservative and right-wing movements, that they only focus on the government, but they have a blind spot for corporations, which can just be as bad. And that's why I'm not a big fan of burning the whole thing down, because if you burn the whole thing down, the entities that will take power once the whole system is scrapped altogether are probably going to be corporate networks, a lot of these NGO networks that have tons of resources in terms of finance and human capital and all that, and they will construct another like type of pseudo government or whatever that is probably going to be even more oppressive than what we have now. That's why I think there has to be people have to be ready to question a lot of assumptions of the current political system, but I don't think they should impulsively just burn it all down, because here's the thing, there are people that still with very nefarious plots and stuff that are very well organized, that are waiting for the situation where the whole system is just scrapped and they'll just come in, swoop right in and build an even more oppressive system.
Yeah, and they have the money and assets existing to do
Yep.
that quite easily. That's one of the lessons of the French Revolution is for all the bloodshed, all the people killed and everything that went on, they literally returned to monarchy in 25 years. Like
Yes.
between 1789 and the rise of Napoleon, that whole thing
Mhm.
took about 25 years, and they ended up right back at monarchy. The First Republic was a terrible failure. And so that's why they're a
Really good
republic
historical
member.
lesson there, actually.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Uh, no, that's a good historical lesson, because you can go on a frenzy, tearing stuff down, destroying stuff, killing people, and all of that, but that's not what creates a stable political order. And you can have legitimate grievances against the system, but if you don't have like a plan that's constructive, that has like a system that alternative system that can replace the current one, you're inevitably going to get outmaneuvered by people that are far more well organized, and they'll have really bad visions for society, but because by virtue of the fact that they're more well organized, they have more funding, they have more people that they can use to build up like and maintain the present order, or even a new system that just looks like the same old system.
Yeah.
They will be able to do that. That's why like I'm not a fan of a lot of really violent protests and other type of insurrectionist activity, because that's actually going back to Palantir. This type of activity does lend credence to the justification for the people pushing Palantir, because they'll say like, hey, we need to monitor all these insurrectionists, all these people destroying property that are protesting violently and engaging in these acts of looting. That gives like the justification for it. That's why reactionary style type of violence that's just done like impulsively, no matter how angry you are at the current system, you have to like act soberly, because if you act really violently, you are lending credence to authoritarians and other people that want to impose these like panopticons and surveillance system, because they like disorder, they like chaos, because that's the rationale, that's the pretext they will use to lock the country down even further.
Yes, and I think there's an argument to be made about, how effective violent protest is or is not. But one thing it's very good at doing is it's giving existing power structures the excuse to crack down further. Um,
Yep.
yeah. And that can end up being a negative feedback loop, and there's lots of historical examples of that
Mhm.
as well. Yeah, it's a very difficult. it's a very difficult sort of thing, but I do think, kind of bringing the conversation full circle, we have reached a certain inflection point on the Israel issue, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I think as the boomers die off and leave power, and we
Oh,
get
I don't
Gen
know.
X and millennials in charge, where there's going to be a sea tide change on that
100%.
issue. Yeah, a sea tide change.
Yeah, that I've 100% agree. The I've talked to a lot of people about this, and that's generally the consensus from people on the Israeli skeptic right to progressives. The consensus there is that once boomers are out of the political picture, and especially millennials and Gen Z come of political age,
Yeah.
and even Gen Xers too, because they're also more skeptical. You're going to see a complete paradigm shift, and I think you will start to see also more discussions about the validity of the post World War II liberal international order in general, because most of these generations, these younger generations that I've noticed, is that they're more likely to question things. They don't take things for granted, and they're more willing to ask uncomfortable questions about the ruling class and the present political order, in my opinion. And that's going to lead to more fruitful discussions that will solve a lot of the lingering problems we have. Because I am of the view that when you have a system where people can barely afford housing or start, much less start families and all this, you have to wonder, like, was this built on a house of cards from the start? And then we have to go from there, reverse engineer these issues and come up with better solutions, because I think the present system has failed.
I think, well, yes, I mean, I think there is a definite, frustration in are the present economic circumstances. Although, like I said, I wish that energy were directed more towards economic systemic issues. Instead, it's being directed outwards towards you know, our international relations and our foreign policy and things like that. Because here's I think the depressing thing is, for all the changes that we might want to make with diplomacy around the world and all this sort of thing, none of that's going to solve the housing crisis. That's what I think is kind of the ironic part, is of all the stuff that, we're cutting, all this everything, it's not going to move the needle on housing prices or the cost to start a family or healthcare or anything like that. Those are all things we have to do internally ourselves with our own economic system. And I think getting people rallied around that flag to start addressing those issues is going to be a lot more difficult.
Yes, I'd also add as well, certain culture war issues are designed specifically to break solidarity and divert attention away from some of, like, just the naked theft that big finance and oligarchical interests are able to get away with, in my opinion. And this constant state of pseudo polarization that I think is largely engineered by elites in, like, the media, cultural spaces, and political spaces is done to prevent the actual emergence of a real populist movement that puts high finance and the military industrial complex and all these other oligarchical interests in check.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely, especially with the support of Musk's Doge and all this sort of thing, this idea of where is the money going? Our economy produces $30 trillion in value a year. Well, the government takes in 5 trillion of that. Where is the money going? Because I think people look at their town, their neighborhood, their state, and they say, because you wouldn't know it to see it, and that's just the federal government. We're not even getting into state taxes, local taxes, sales taxes.
Mhm.
Where is the money going? And I think there is, the left would say, yeah, we need to tax the rich. The money's in the pockets of the wealthy, and we need to get a hold of that. And I think a lot of people on the right would complain that it's, gone into ever larger government, getting ever more involved in people's lives, all this type of thing. I think the central thing that they share is a general feeling that government as an institution, as an idea, from the city council on up, is not working for the everyday person. It's working for wealthy interests. And
Yeah.
ironically, that's something that when you say that, regardless of what people's political persuasion are, that's becoming a much more common sort of position. I was doing a recording on Monday with someone, we were having the self same conversation. Um, and so I think that's an interesting thing, that people are starting to look at the system as a whole and saying it's a great system for about 10%, the top 10%. Everyone
Yes.
else, this system does not work, you know.
Yeah, that's the issue because, and I like how you mentioned local and state government because I've been heavily involved in those type of activities, and you see the same dynamics. I've long argued that state and local governments are kind of like the farm leagues for the federal level, where most corrupt politicians and other figures get their start there and they move their way up. And
Of course, yeah.
these places are just microcosms of what's going on in DC. And yeah, there's a ton of waste and money being spent to serve certain interests. And yes, there is a growing realization amongst the public that the government we have is not only like captured by these elite interests, it's like run by and for high finance, defense industry, and other actors that don't really care about the long-term prosperity of the US. They're in it for a quick buck. That's why more and more things in the US, they start to look more like a scam. Like it's like a scam by people who are trying to make a quick buck and then just run out of town. And you just cannot have a society that way. Like no nation state can function in that manner. And that's one of the reasons why I think like a lot of people they're not only like checking out of the system, but they are also starting to view it increasingly as illegitimate.
Yes, I agree. And there's kind of an interesting social dynamic at play that I think is, and then you start to see this around immigration a lot, where people, especially on Twitter, will say, the US is a country with its own history and its own people. It's not an economic zone. Which I laugh because I'm like, historically, that's never been true, but okay. And you start hearing people calling themselves heritage Americans, which I think is just a nicer name for white people. Um, and it appears that contrary to the principles on which this country was founded, people want, I think there's this weird desire to be not just a country anchored on an idea, and America is an idea, but to be a country anchored in a people, a blood, an ethnicity, a soil sort of thing, um, in sort of an odd reaction to immigration and this big recent wave of immigration of 40 years and how it's changed society and everything. And that people kind of want to really invest in this ethnic American identity that has just not been present in our country before. And I think, to your point, I think some of that anti-immigration, anti-remittances, heritage American thing is a reaction to the perception that our country has become an economic zone for the wealthy with no help for the everyday person.
Well, this is a much more sensitive topic. I tend to favor immigration restriction for both like legal and illegal, and I actually do understand some of the anxieties people on the right have about that, and I actually do believe in like the freedom of association, and I support forms of like black separatism and other forms of separatism if people want to engage in that. But I think in these debates we have to keep in mind who are the people that are pushing these policies from like mass migration and high finance. It's oligarchical interest, and yeah, some of this stuff can get kind of heated. Some people will will say nasty things and even engage in nasty acts, and like people should be level headed, but at the same time we have to start realizing that a lot of the stuff being pushed on us from mass migration to runaway finance is organized by these same groups of people that make life in the US increasingly expensive, socially disjointed, and all of that. And I think that we have to start looking at more models of freedom of association and like autonomy and stuff like that. Because I like some of like the message that like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey talked about of building these type of community type of structures, which have actually been largely undermined because of the combination of an overly financialized economy and just in general mass migration, which leads to the erosion of like community bonds and all that. But I think that people have to kind of break away from the typical two-party system that we have, because I just think that leads us to like just more of the same.
Well, I mean, yes, I think one of the biggest flaws of our modern system is that we're stuck in this two-party duopoly, which historically speaking was not a thing. You had third party running successful presidential candidates and getting votes in the electoral college as recently as 1948. In the 19th century, you'd have three, four, five people with votes in the electoral college. Um, this two-party duopoly has been a post World War II, post 1950
Yes.
anomaly. And if anything, I was saying last year during the election, I said, if anything, we're starting to regress to the mean because it's starting to turn back into 19th century politics, which is kind of was the baseline for how things go in this country. And right now it's June 11th, so we're still having the LA riots about the ICE detentions happening, which by the time this airs, that story will be long gone. But this back and forth between Trump and Gavin Newsom, and all this sort of thing, very 19th century, very, very 19th century. 1840s America would be very proud. And I think it's interesting that the post World War II stability, the post Cold War stability of Pax Americana, the whole project we've had going over the last several decades, it's starting to finally break down. And to your point, people are having new ideas of what could the world look like? What else could the world look like? What else could we do? How else might our society be structured? Do we need to continue acting in this way? And I think for a lot of us, that conversation is very frightening because the current system has been so successful. But to your point, successful for who? And at
Yeah.
whose expense? And that's opened up a whole new conversation of how to change things around to perhaps make the success of the system more broad based and to get away from the two-party duopoly, which I'm not sad about because they're both awful. So I'm not sad about, breaking up that little marriage.
Yeah, same here.
But yeah, it is a very interesting thing, and I think this is I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like we're at the beginning of that conversation, not the end. I feel like we'll be having that conversation. I'm 37 years old. We'll be having that conversation in some form for the rest of my life. And I only have
Agreed.
30 years to go. So, we're going to be having that conversation for the next several decades. And I think a lot of political changes in this country are going to be predicated on trying to move away from the old post World War II system.
One point you mentioned that I think is pretty apt about how we're kind of going back to the 19th century. I think we're in another gilded age, if you will, where there is
Certainly.
frightening levels of economic inequality due to the overly financialized and also big tech dominated economy we live in that is creating this kind of Elysium type of environment where people, the mega rich, they live like just like gods, whereas the rest of us just labor our day-to-day lives like mere peons. And this is going to be one of the biggest topics discussed, I think, about the role of high finance in society because it is very corrosive. And if you look at most empires, they tend to collapse over time because of the excesses of their ruling classes that are addicted to fast, easy money and just living in the present and not caring about their posterity and building like a sustainable economic system. And I think the US is no exception to this because there's a lot of people that talk about the US being exceptional, but the US is ultimately run by humans, by human institutions and all that, and with all the attendant flaws. So it's very much susceptible to a lot of the shortcomings of imperial orders that we've seen across history. And we may be in for a real-time socio-political experiment where we see a once superpower start to decline in socioeconomic terms, and many people are not ready for that. But I think that that's like kind of the portion of my work is to kind of give people like the information about what's actually going on and take that and apply it and make what you will of it, because I think that we cannot use outdated models and engage in the type of politics that you see on TV, because that's just blinding us from some uncomfortable truths that people don't really want to discuss.
No, I think that's quite true. I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of talk about the decline narrative, and I'm not entirely on the decline narrative train, but I will say I think there is, things have their season and they come to an end. And the reality is the post-World War II order survived for a surprisingly long time. 80 years, it has survived and gone on. And I think, people are having a new and different conversation about it as they want to do. And they're looking for, a new change, a new movement, a new something. And I think most importantly, wanting a system that works for the everyday person. I remember years ago when I first started this in 2014. Um, I was talking about someone and I was explaining political donations and how the wealthy and corporations use political donations and other stuff to manipulate government, and how government has become a line item expense for the wealthy and corporations. And my exasperated friend said, okay, but if they've bought all the government officials and they bought all of our elected representatives, who's working for us? And I'm like, no one, by design. Like,
Yeah.
and they were absolutely flabbergasted that I'm like, no one's working for you. No one. Oh, nothing. Yeah. And it's, I think in the intervening 11 years since I've had that conversation, that's gone from a nascent idea I wrote about in one of my first essays to almost common parlance. The jig is up and people know
Yes.
it. And I think there's going to be interesting changes as people try to chip away at that system, both action and reaction. People will try to chip away at it. The wealthy will try to hang on.
Yes. I think that we will I don't think there's gonna be a collapse per se, but we will see the system have to be retooled to conform to like the new realities of the 21st century. Because I think the 21st century is this really different time and place in terms of economic organization and socioeconomic characterizations as well, because you have like a thoroughly post-industrial digital service economy, and that's going to have different challenges. And I think like the current political system we have, it's just not adequate for the times. And I think yeah, to your point, people now understand that like you can talk to anybody from a democratic socialist to even America First populist. They'll all admit that the system is run by like some form of oligarchical interests. The problem has always been is how do you wrest power from those oligarchical interests? And that's going to be the question that's going to have to be answered in the decades to come.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's an excellent place to stop for now. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. This is the part of the show where we do plugs. Let us know where we can find you online and keep up with your work.
Yeah, so people can find my work on Substack, Jose Nino Unfiltered, josbcf.substack.com. And then also, I'm on X, Twitter at Jose Al Nino. That's where I'm most prominent on. And my podcast is also on Substack and it's shared on YouTube as well. El Nino Speaks.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
It was a pleasure, man. Thank you.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.